We had a car accident and I discovered her infidelity on her unlocked phone. Now I will leave her on the street with nothing. Hello Reddit. If you ever wondered what it feels like to hold the weapon with which you have just been murdered from behind, let me tell you that it feels exactly like a glass and metal cell phone stained with blood. I do not come to this forum to ask you to feel sorry for me. The capacity to feel sorry for myself disappeared a couple of hours ago, drowned by an overdose of adrenaline and betrayal. I am writing this from a waiting room with peeling walls in a public hospital, with a compression bandage that cuts off my breathing, a sharp pain in my 2 fractured ribs, and my clothes still wet from the rain. A few meters from here, a team of traumatologists has been operating on my wife emergently for almost 4 hours to try to save her right leg and reconstruct her hip. She and I suffered a massive and devastating traffic accident this very afternoon. Just 5 hours ago, I turned the steering wheel of my car with all my strength to take the impact head-on and save her life. 4 hours ago, sitting in this same rigid plastic chair, I discovered that the woman I was willing to die for deceived me in the most cruel and systematic way possible, and that she was using me as a blind chauffeur to go sleep with her lover minutes before we almost got killed on the avenue. My name is Felipe, I am 33 years old, and my life has always been based on tranquility and routine. I am an observant, silent man, the kind who avoids conflict at all costs and prefers to analyze people from a distance before voicing an opinion. I don't have a dazzling profession nor do I earn millions, I simply have an administrative job that requires many hours but pays the bills on time and keeps a roof over our heads. I always believed that my infinite patience and my ability to stay calm were virtues, but my wife, Daniela, always saw them as an unforgivable weakness. Daniela is 31 years old and is a person who suffocates if there is no chaos around her. She needs to be the center of attention, she needs constant drama, loud outings, and uninterrupted external validation. We have been married for 5 years and the balance of our relationship was always tipped in her favor. I was the boring anchor that guaranteed her financial stability, while she dedicated herself to collecting expensive hobbies, weekend trips with friends to meditate, and dinners in places we could barely afford. I never raised my voice to demand anything from her. I blindly believed that loving someone meant giving them the space and resources to be happy. While she went out to show off her new clothes, I stayed home working overtime from my laptop, eating cold leftovers and cleaning the kitchen. Sometimes, while I sharpened my carbon steel knife preparing something to eat in the early hours of the morning, she would walk past me sighing with annoyance, muttering that I was a boring old man and that my lack of initiative depressed her. I just lowered my head and kept chopping the vegetables. The respect I had for her was absolute, but she invented a parallel reality where my nobility was simply stupidity that she could exploit at will. The disaster that brought me to this emergency room began to brew this afternoon, when the city sky closed completely and unleashed a storm of biblical proportions. The water fell with an uncontrollable fury and the streets turned into dark rivers. Daniela came out of our bedroom wearing an expensive dress, with perfect makeup and a perfume that flooded the hallway. She demanded, with that sharp and authoritative voice she uses when she doesn't take no for an answer, that I get the car out immediately and take her to a hotel located at the other end of the district. Her excuse was that one of her best friends from high school had just suffered a severe nervous breakdown, that she was alone in that room, and that she was the only person in the world capable of containing her emotionally. I didn't doubt her word. I grabbed the keys and we went out into the downpour. From the moment she sat in the passenger seat, I noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin was thick and cutting. Daniela didn't take her eyes off her screen for a single second. Her fingers typed at a furious speed and, every time I slightly turned my head to check the right rearview mirror, she would abruptly lock the phone and hide it against her chest with a defensive and paranoid attitude. I asked her if her friend was in real danger. Focus on driving once and for all and stop asking useless questions, Daniela answered me, spitting the words with a contempt that froze my blood more than the cold of the rain. I was driving at about 45 kilometers per hour, gripping the steering wheel with so much tension that my wrists hurt. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up. We were crossing a 4-lane avenue, a huge intersection where our traffic light shone a bright and clear green. I began to cross with caution. There was no prior sound, no horns, no skidding brakes. The mass of dark metal appeared out of nowhere on my left side. A huge heavy cargo truck, speeding and with its lights off in the storm, ran its red light. The imminent collision was reflected in my window. In that fraction of a second where animal instinct takes control, my brain calculated that if I continued my trajectory in a straight line, the truck's grille would directly crush Daniela's door, killing her beyond remedy. Without thinking, I gave a brutal and suicidal yank of the steering wheel to the left. I forced my own side of the vehicle to receive the total and absolute transfer of the destructive impact, sacrificing my integrity so that she would live. The sound of the crash was deafening, like an explosion of dynamite inside a closed space. The door on my side caved inward, hitting my ribs with a violence that knocked the air out of my lungs. The car was lifted off the ground, spun violently on the wet asphalt, and crashed tailfirst into a huge concrete pillar. I lost consciousness due to the brute force of the inertia. When I opened my eyes again, the smell of coolant, gunpowder from the airbags, and blood flooded the wrecked car. The rain poured in through the pulverized windows. I blinked a couple of times to wipe the blood running down my forehead. I looked to my right. Daniela was completely unconscious, her head tilted and her right leg brutally trapped under the twisted plastics and metals of what once was the car's dashboard. Panic completely overcame me. I fought against the jammed seatbelt, forced the mechanism until my hands were scraped, and managed to free myself. I kicked my door open and fell onto the freezing asphalt. The emergency services took 10 eternal minutes to arrive. I watched as the firefighters used hydraulic tools to cut the chassis of my car and free my wife. They lifted her onto an orange stretcher, put an orthopedic collar on her, and loaded her into the ambulance. While a rescuer searched the interior of the vehicle for our IDs, he found Daniela's bag wedged under the back seat. When he pulled it, her cell phone fell onto the soaked avenue. The rubber protective case absorbed the blow and the screen did not break. The rescuer quickly wiped it against his pants and put it in my jacket pocket before they loaded me into a second ambulance. The trip to the hospital was a chaos of sirens and blinding lights. They rushed her to the highly complex operating room and left me in a fast-track care area, where they treated me, bandaged me, and injected me with painkillers before sending me to this damn empty waiting room. I sat in this chair, trembling from the cold and anguish, and put my hand in my pocket. I took out her phone. My only intention, my only thought in that moment of absolute terror, was to find her older sister's number to let her know that Daniela was in critical surgery. I pressed the button to turn on the screen. My heart stopped for an endless second when I realized that the system did not ask for the numeric security code. The violent impact of the truck had occurred in the exact millisecond she was using the device, and the automatic screen lock never activated. The private messaging application was open in the foreground. The name of the contact at the top left me breathless: Ignacio. Ignacio was the supposed instructor of a painting course she religiously attended. An arrogant and pretentious guy to whom I myself had served a glass of wine when she invited him to dinner at our house a few months ago. The last message she had sent him, with the timestamp registering exactly a minute and a half before we were almost crushed to death on the avenue, said verbatim, "I'm arriving at the hotel my love, my idiot husband is bringing me in this disgusting storm thinking I'm going to cry with a friend, get the bed ready and wait for me without clothes." I was left in a state of shock so deep and dark that the physical pain of my broken bones completely disappeared. The humming of the hospital machines faded from my mind. I read that disgusting text a dozen times, desperately looking for some excuse, some context error, some inside joke that would justify the abomination I was witnessing. But there was no margin for error. With a stiff thumb, I began to scroll up the screen, immersing myself in an endless history of conversations. I didn't need to hack absolutely anything to discover the monster I had married. What I found there was a massive, systematic, and ruthless arsenal of lies that dated back more than a year and a half. I discovered that Daniela cheated on me for months at each of her supposed meditation retreats. While I worked overtime and stayed home eating cheap noodles to save money, she was rolling around in luxury cabins with this parasite. I read with pure disgust how they mocked me daily. They laughed at my quiet personality, my worn-out clothes, and how I was always too tired to go out partying. They planned their lies together so that I would continue to pay absolutely all the expenses of our apartment, allowing her to spend her entire salary on expensive lingerie and private dinners for him. Ignacio is a married man, and in the messages they cynically discussed how to evade his wife, a woman named Luciana who earned a very high salary as a financial director and who, unknowingly, paid for the expensive whims of her cheating husband. Daniela and he documented their misery with intimate photographs sent from our own bathroom and bank transfer receipts from hidden motels. Every word I read pierced my brain. I had just smashed my own vehicle and my own body against the structure of a heavy truck to prevent the metal from crushing a woman who saw me as a dispensable ATM and a constant object of mockery. Just as bile rose in my throat upon finishing reading those atrocities, the swinging doors of the surgical area flew open. A trauma surgeon, with his surgical gown stained and his face covered in sweat, walked directly toward me. I stood up, enduring the crunch in my fractured ribs. The doctor looked at me with a mixture of deep compassion and immense respect. He informed me that they had managed to stop Daniela's severe arterial bleeding, but that her right hip and femur were pulverized. They were inserting titanium plates and dozens of surgical screws into her at this very moment. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder and told me, his voice cracking with admiration, that the firefighters and experts had commented on the dynamics of the crash. He told me that the suicidal yank of the steering wheel I took to the left to receive the full impact was an act of pure heroism and love, and that without that evasive maneuver, my wife would have been instantly decapitated by the metal. I thanked the doctor with a voice completely dry, empty, and devoid of all human emotion, and asked him to return to the operating room to finish his work. I sat back down in his plastic chair in the waiting room. I have her device clutched in my hand, burning with the evidence of her absolute wickedness. She is going to wake up from general anesthesia tomorrow morning. She is going to be immobilized, sedated, expecting to find her submissive, understanding, and devoted husband sitting by her side, willing to work 4 times as hard to pay for her private rehabilitation and endure her usual abuse while she recovers. I do not have the slightest intention of screaming at her. I am not going to make a cheap soap opera scene in the hallways of this place. I am processing all this information in the most absolute silence, letting the incandescent fury be replaced by a tactical, dark, and calculating coldness. Reddit, if you were in my exact place, with a broken body and knowing that you spilled your own blood to save the life of your own executioner, how would you deliver the coup de grace? I will be reading each of your comments throughout this long night so as not to lose focus or sanity. First update: 48 hours have passed since I wrote my first post from that freezing plastic chair in the emergency room. I read each of your comments on Reddit and I thank you deeply for being my anchor to reality in the darkest, densest, and most confusing moment of my entire existence. The vast majority of you suggested that I walk into Daniela's room as soon as she came out of surgery, scream all her truths in her face, show her the explicit photos, and throw the cell phone at her chest. But doing that would have been playing exactly on the field where she always wins. Daniela is the absolute queen of scenic drama. She feeds on constant conflict, on screaming in the hallways, and on crocodile tears. I, on the other hand, operate from tactical silence, precise planning, and patience. In the early hours after the accident, while she was still on the operating table surrounded by surgeons, I made a completely cold, surgical, and lethal decision. I didn't need to hack absolutely anything on her device because she, in her infinite and blind arrogance, left the phone unlocked and all her applications wide open. I sat in an isolated corner of the waiting room, under the hum of a broken fluorescent light, connected her phone to the hospital's public wireless network, and spent 4 solid hours patiently forwarding every disgusting text message, every mocking voice note, every compromising photograph, and every bank transfer receipt from the motels to a secure and encrypted email account that I created at that very moment. I compiled an absolute, massive, and irrefutable digital arsenal that none of her pathological lies could ever dismantle. When I finished securing all the evidence that she systematically cheated on me, using the financial app on my own mobile phone, I logged into our shared savings account. We had a total of $58,000 saved, money that came almost entirely from my countless hours of overtime at the office and my austere lifestyle, funds that I religiously kept for our supposed future together. Without my pulse trembling a single millimeter, I transferred every damn cent to an individual and private account in my name at a different bank. Legally, I took the half that belonged to me by right of effort and I retained the other half in advance as compensation for the destructive divorce process that she didn't yet know was going to crush her perfect life. At 7:30 in the morning, the lead surgeon came out to tell me that the extremely long operation had concluded and that she was resting in the severe trauma recovery room. I got up from the chair, feeling the sharp pain in my 2 fractured ribs with every step I took, and walked down the immaculate hallways. I entered her private room in the most absolute silence. Daniela was extremely pale, surrounded by heart monitors, with her hip completely immobilized by a heavy metal support and titanium nails. When she heavily opened her eyes due to the effect of the anesthesia, she saw me standing at the foot of her medical bed. There were no tears of relief on her part upon seeing me alive in front of her. The nurse who was adjusting the intravenous drip left the room to give us privacy. Daniela sighed, tried to move, let out a sharp moan of pain, and stared right into my eyes. With terrifying coldness, she quickly invented that her head hurt a lot from the impact and that she was extremely worried about her poor friend in crisis who had been waiting for her at the hotel, insinuating with her tone of voice that the accident had been my fault for not knowing how to drive in the rain. I looked at her without blinking. My face was a mask of solid and impenetrable stone. I didn't mention Ignacio's name to her. I didn't tell her that I knew the whole truth. I simply nodded my head slowly, absorbing her level of psychopathy. "Don't worry about your friend right now. Focus on surviving and not losing your leg," I told her in a freezing, neutral voice, devoid of all empathy. I turned around and walked towards the door. She called my name a couple of times with a weak, confused, and demanding voice, expecting me to come back and hold her hand, but I didn't stop or turn my neck to look at her. I walked out of the public hospital, hailed a taxi on the avenue that was still full of puddles, and drove back to our apartment. I gathered absolutely all my clothes in 4 large travel suitcases, took my personal documents, my backup hard drives, and even went to the kitchen, took my precious carbon steel knife that I used to prepare her dinner, and locked it in a safe. It ceased to be my home in that exact moment. I put my metal copy of the keys on the glass dining table and left that place, locking the door behind me forever. Second update: exactly 6 weeks have passed since the night of the torrential crash, and the picture is radically different from what Daniela imagined in her delusions of grandeur. My ex-wife's physical recovery has been an agonizing, dark, and deeply humiliating process for her. Because I was not present to be her personal servant, her chauffeur, and her nurse 24 hours a day, she had to swallow her immense pride and beg her retired parents over the phone to travel by bus from the interior of the country to take her to their small rural house. She cannot walk on her own, she cannot fend for herself in the most basic tasks, and she will be tied to an uncomfortable orthopedic wheelchair for at least 5 more months. During these 6 weeks of absolute and sepulchral silence on my part, I have been moving my pieces on the legal board with the relentless precision of a surgeon. I hired one of the most feared and expensive litigating divorce lawyers in my city, a 50-year-old man who does not have an ounce of patience for emotional excuses in court. I handed him the complete printed folder with all the irrefutable evidence of the systematic infidelity. But my lawyer and I knew that, in order to secure a crushing tactical advantage, we also had to neutralize the parasite that collaborated in the destruction of my marriage. Ignacio, the pretentious and mocking lover, was married to Luciana. Luciana is an extremely successful and renowned financial director in the corporate sector, and she was the one who indirectly financed, with her sweat and intellectual effort, Ignacio's luxurious dinners, designer clothes, and hotels, since he earned less than a third of his wife's salary being a mediocre art instructor. I didn't have to hire anyone to follow him. Daniela's own phone had all the explicit information about the movements and secrets of this individual. I contacted Luciana through her company's executive secretary, requesting a brief meeting of an urgent and confidential nature. When I entered her immense and elegant glass-walled office, I sat in front of her desk and didn't waste time on useless pleasantries. I took out of my briefcase a thick manila envelope containing 60 pages printed in full color with the most degrading conversations, the receipts from the clandestine reservations, and the intimate photographs that her husband and my wife send each other daily. Luciana read the first 10 pages in complete and absolute silence. I saw the blood leave her face until she was pale as paper, and her hands began to tremble slightly, but she proved to be a woman of admirable emotional intelligence and composure. She didn't scream. She didn't break any object in her office. She simply looked up, folded her hands on the table, thanked me while looking me in the eyes with an ultra-professional voice loaded with pain, and asked me to send the complete digital copies to her personal and encrypted email. That same afternoon, as I later learned from mutual acquaintances, Luciana arrived at her huge house, packed all of Ignacio's expensive clothes in 3 giant black garbage bags and threw him out on the street in front of all his wealthy neighbors in the exclusive residential area, throwing his painting canvases onto the wet pavement without even giving him a minute to try to justify himself with his usual lies. Ignacio called me on my personal phone that same night at 3 in the morning. He was completely drunk, crying pathetically and slurring his words to scream insults at me, accusing me of being a resentful coward and of having ruined his perfect life of luxury out of pure irrational spite. I listened to his miserable insults for 30 long seconds, let out a short, dry laugh that I know destroyed him inside, and hung up on him, blocking his number instantly. The next morning, the official civil court server hand-delivered to Daniela, directly in the medical bed of the childhood bedroom at her parents' house, the formal and sealed papers of our divorce. The document aggressively stipulated that I would not pay a single cent in alimony, nor would I cover absolutely any of her immense medical expenses, arguing prolonged moral abandonment of the home and presenting as a public annex the disgusting summary of her widely documented infidelity. I sat down to wait for the shockwave. Third update: 10 long months have passed since that eternal night of torrential rain and ambulance sirens, and I write this last update to close this exhausting chapter of my existence and leave you a real testimony that karma, when backed by solid evidence and a brilliant lawyer, is an absolutely devastating and precise force. The divorce was finalized just 2 weeks ago in the Central District Courts. Daniela, advised by a public defender that her parents went into debt to get, tried to fight in court desperately. She demanded amidst theatrical tears that I pay her exorbitant surgery and hospitalization bills, which amounted to more than $90,000, falsely arguing in front of the judge that the destructive crash occurred while I was driving negligently and recklessly in the rain. But my experienced lawyer destroyed her story immediately. He presented before the bench, using the rigorous police traffic report and the firefighter's report, the undeniable proof that the accident was the absolute fault of the truck that ran the red light, and that my suicidal swerve was the only reason she did not die decapitated on the spot. Then, in that same room, my lawyer masterfully exposed how she used me as a blind chauffeur that same rainy night to go sleep with her lover in a downtown hotel, showing the printed messages certified by a notary. The judge, visibly disgusted by the level of cynicism and moral cruelty of my ex-wife, remained in complete shock for a second before dismissing all of her ridiculous financial claims in less than 15 minutes, ruling overwhelmingly in my favor. The catastrophic and final result for Daniela went far beyond simply losing her comfortable lifestyle, her meditation retreats, and her luxuries financed at my expense. She was totally and sickeningly convinced that Ignacio was going to run to rescue her now that they were both free from their marriages, that he would be the savior who would take her out of her parents' depressing room and support her financially. But the reality of consequences forgives no one. Ignacio was completely and absolutely financially annihilated by Luciana in her own corporate divorce process. It turns out that Luciana, being the calculating and intelligent woman she is, had made him sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement on their wedding day, and literally left him in ruins, forced to rent a tiny and dark room in a marginal area of the city, carrying alone the immense and suffocating debts from the various credit cards he frantically used to impress my ex-wife. When Daniela contacted him weeks ago from her wheelchair to beg him to support her financially with her past due medical bills and her painful physiotherapy sessions, Ignacio yelled at her that she was a curse that had ruined his comfortable life, blocked her from all social media, changed his phone number, and completely disappeared from her radar. He abandoned her to her fate at the exact moment in her life when she most needed support. Last night, just before preparing my dinner, my phone screen lit up with an extremely long, chaotic, and miserable text message sent from an unknown number. It was Daniela. She was writing to me secretly from her mother's old cell phone because her own phone line was cut off due to lack of payment. In the extensive message, she groveled and begged me to forgive her for all the pain caused. She told me that during her endless nights of insomnia and chronic pain she had realized that I was always the only good, loyal, and noble man who truly cared for her and genuinely protected her in this world, that Ignacio was just a stupid mistake born of her emotional immaturity, and that please, for the good times we shared, let her come back to my side because the painful daily physiotherapy was too much for her alone and her elderly parents didn't even have money to buy her the most basic painkillers. I read her desperate and calculating words from beginning to end, feeling such a great apathy and such unshakable inner peace that I had not experienced in many years. The haughty woman who belittled me daily, who laughed at my effort with her lover while I worked, was now desperately begging for my attention and my resources from the bottom of the dark well she dug with her own hands. I answered her with a very short, brutally direct, and crushing text message. Okay, good luck with your debt, never contact me again in your life, I wrote to her, pressing each letter with absolute calm. I immediately blocked her and her entire family from my network provider's settings. Now I am sitting peacefully on the large balcony of my new and quiet apartment, drinking strong black coffee and breathing completely clean air. My ribs healed completely, leaving no after effects, my bank account is secured and growing thanks to my honest work, and my peace of mind is absolute. Sometimes, when I see it rain through the window, I still surprise myself remembering Daniela's astonishing audacity to write to her lover sitting a few centimeters from me in that car, but I deeply and sincerely thank destiny that that out-of-control truck violently crossed our path that stormy afternoon. It was the most destructive and traumatic physical impact of my life, but it was also the undeniable force that broke my heavy chains once and for all. Never let anyone mistake your silence, your patience, and your capacity for work for mental weakness. Observe everything, keep the evidence in silence, and then, when you have all the power in your hands, strike where it hurts the most without any kind of mercy. Thank you, Reddit. I say goodbye forever and close this chapter of my life.